Welcome to latest news blast. Nelson, painting a portrait of a man who was not simply the smiling, gentle prophet the world saw on Sunday broadcasts, but also a deeply complex figure who carried the burden of leadership, the scars of personal struggles, and, as she emphasized, the kind of flaws that leaders never want the public to know, revealing that behind the polished image of faith and unwavering confidence stood a man who sometimes doubted his path, who privately agonized over decisions that affected millions, and who confided in Wendy late at night that the pressure of guiding a global church was at times unbearable. And as gasps spread across the audience, Wendy went further, sharing that there were disagreements within the highest councils of the church, moments when Russell felt betrayed by those closest to him, and nights when he wondered if history would remember him for his divine callings, or for the controversies that seemed to follow his leadership. And in this raw moment, she described him as both a man of God and a man of flesh, someone who struggled with the same fears, insecurities, and human emotions as anyone else. And then came the most shocking part, as Wendy disclosed that in the months leading up to his death, Russell confided a series of visions and warnings he claimed to have received, visions that were never made public, and that painted a much darker picture of the future than the optimistic sermons he delivered. For according to Wendy, he told her of a coming wave of crises that would test the faith of every believer, of internal divisions within the church that would rise to the surface, and of global events that would shake not only nations but the very foundations of organized religion. And as Wendy's words filled the hall, some wept openly, some shook their heads in disbelief, and others seemed almost relieved that at last someone close to Russell had spoken what many suspected, but dared not articulate. And she continued by addressing the personal sacrifices she had made as his wife, confessing that at times she felt invisible, overshadowed by the public's devotion to him, but she remained by his side because she believed in his sincerity even when the world doubted him, because she knew his private heart. The man who prayed endlessly not for power or recognition but for forgiveness, for strength, for the courage to carry a mantle that weighed more heavily than anyone outside could ever imagine. And yet, as Wendy revealed, Russell also made decisions that broke her heart, such as prioritizing the institution over family moments, choosing to attend leadership councils while missing birthdays, holidays, and even moments of illness. And these words pierced the room with a new level of honesty, forcing listeners to reconsider the image of spiritual perfection often projected by leaders. And still Wendy was not finished, for she turned her attention to the legacy Russell himself wanted to leave behind, explaining that shortly before his passing he wrote private letters addressed not to the church but to his family, in which he admitted regrets, confessed his humanity, and urged them not to worship him as a flawless prophet but to remember him as a servant who tried his best, a man who stumbled and rose again, a father and husband who often failed but kept trying. And she insisted that these letters would one day be made public so the world could finally see Russell Nelson not as a figurehead but as a real man who bore the impossible expectations of millions. And this statement sent ripples through the crowd, because never before had a prophet's wife promised to reveal such intimate documents. And though some applauded her bravery, others whispered that her words threatened to unravel the carefully maintained image of the church's leadership. But Wendy pressed on, recalling the final days of his life, when he asked her to keep certain truths alive even if others tried to bury them, and she declared with tears streaming down her face that she would honor that promise no matter the cost. And in that moment the funeral was no longer a ceremony of mourning, but a stage for truth-telling, a reckoning with decades of secrecy, and a moment that may well be remembered as the day Wendy Nelson changed the narrative forever. For after her words, silence fell over the gathering, broken only by sobs, and though church officials quickly tried to redirect the service back to familiar hymns and prayers, the world had already heard too much to turn back, because now, millions across the globe are asking themselves whether the leader they followed so faithfully was a saint, a flawed man, or perhaps both, and whether his wife's courage in exposing these truths will lead to greater transparency within the faith, or to even deeper controversy. But one thing is certain, the funeral of Russell Nelson will not be remembered for its hymns or its sermons, but for Wendy Nelson's voice. A voice that carried decades of hidden truths into the light, forever changing the story of a man who led millions and the church he left behind.
And even after those shocking words brought the funeral hall into a heavy silence, Wendy Nelson's eyes still burned with unspoken truths, and instead of stepping away, she leaned closer to the microphone, as if carried by an inner force that would not let her stop. And she told the crowd that her husband's legacy could not be fully understood without uncovering the conflicts and controversies he tried to shield from the public, admitting that Russell
Nelson carried within him both the radiant faith of a prophet and the hidden torment of a man who knew that not all decisions made in the name of leadership were without pain. And she revealed that in his final years, Russell grew increasingly troubled by the widening gap between the image of unity presented by the church and the quiet disagreements raging behind closed doors, where leaders clashed over doctrine, policy, and the direction of the faith. And while Russell was always presented as the final authority, Wendy confessed that in private, he admitted to her how deeply divided the council sometimes was, and how he feared that one day those divisions would become public and test the faith of members around the world. And she recounted moments when Russell would return home late at night, exhausted and broken, whispering that being the prophet felt less like a blessing and more like a burden. And Wendy said she had begged him to share more of his vulnerabilities with the public, so that followers would know their leader was human. But Russell always refused, saying the world would never accept a prophet who admitted weakness. And then she paused, looked across the rows of grieving family and leaders, and said with trembling conviction that it was time the world knew the truth, that even prophets cried alone, even prophets doubted themselves, even prophets sometimes felt abandoned by the very God they served. And these words caused audible gasps, for never before had a wife of a prophet spoken so directly about the frailty of her husband's faith. And Wendy pressed further, revealing that Russell's private journals contained confessions of inner conflict about decisions that changed the lives of millions of believers. And she described how he struggled over issues of inclusivity, over the roles of women in leadership, over policies that weighed heavily on his conscience. Yet he kept silent in public because he feared that speaking openly might fracture the faith. And Wendy declared that these journals would one day be read not just by his family but by the world, because Russell himself told her before his passing, "Do not let them bury my struggles, let them know I was real." And those words, she said, became her mission at this funeral, to show the world the man behind the prophet, the truth behind the title. And as people wiped away tears, Wendy grew even more daring, hinting that in his last visions Russell foresaw turbulence, not only within the church, but also across the world. And she claimed that he spoke to her about a spiritual battle that would rise in the years ahead, warning her that the church would not be immune to scandals, betrayals, and exposure. And she insisted that Russell believed the only way the faith could survive would be through truth, transparency, and courage, not silence, secrecy, and control. And in this moment, the atmosphere in the funeral hall shifted again, as though everyone knew they were no longer simply hearing a widow's grief but witnessing a prophecy unfold. And Wendy's voice softened as she shared one final memory of her husband, recalling how in his very last prayer before slipping away, he asked not to be remembered as a flawless prophet but as a man who tried to love, tried to serve, and tried to remain faithful even when his own heart was heavy. And she said through tears that the world needed to stop worshiping perfect images of leaders and start embracing their humanity, because only then could faith survive the storms ahead. And as the funeral concluded, it was clear that the story of Russell M. Nelson would never again be told the same way, because Wendy Nelson had done what no one expected. She had exposed hidden truths, revealed the private heart of a prophet, and forever changed the narrative of one of the most influential religious figures of the modern era. And though many thought Wendy Nelson would finally step back and allow the service to return to solemn hymns and tributes, she remained standing with a firmness that suggested her mission was not yet complete. And she declared that silence had been the church's greatest weapon but also its greatest weakness, because while silence protected reputations, it also buried truths that could have healed generations, if only they had been acknowledged. And she admitted that Russell himself often wrestled with this duality, torn between preserving the image of perfection and revealing the messy humanity that actually defined his ministry. And she told the mourners that in their private conversations he would sometimes break down, saying, "If they only knew how often I cried before God, how often I questioned myself, how often I begged for clarity." And Wendy insisted that those tears were not a sign of failure, but proof that leadership was not about being flawless, but about carrying the unbearable weight of responsibility with trembling hands. And then her tone shifted from sorrow to defiance as she revealed that there were voices inside the church that begged her not to speak today, that urged her to give a carefully polished eulogy and nothing more. But she looked directly at those leaders seated in the front rows and said, "I loved him too much to let him leave this world as a myth. He deserves to be remembered as a man." And her words drew both applause and gasps, as though the entire room could not decide whether to revere her bravery or recoil at her candor. And Wendy continued by painting vivid portraits of Russell's private life, confessing that at home he was not the untouchable prophet but a husband who sometimes struggled to connect, a father who admitted regrets about the time he sacrificed, and even a man who worried that his followers saw him more as a symbol than as a soul, and she recalled nights when he would sit awake in silence, staring out the window and whispering, "Will they ever forgive me for the choices I made?" And she reminded the audience that these choices were not made lightly, but each carried a cost that weighed on his spirit until the very end. And in perhaps the most startling moment yet, Wendy spoke of a private letter Russell left behind that was never meant for the pulpit, a letter in which he apologized, not just to his family but to the faithful around the world, for moments when his leadership hurt more than it healed, admitting that though he believed he acted under inspiration, he knew some decisions left scars, and he prayed that those wounds would one day be mended by love, not by policy. And Wendy promised that letter would be preserved, not hidden, so that history would see him not as a man who denied mistakes, but as a leader humble enough to confess them. And as her voice quivered with emotion, she warned that hiding this side of him would dishonor his memory, because his greatest fear was being remembered as something he was not, and her insistence on truth became the heartbeat of her entire speech, echoing across the hall as if to demand that every listener reconsider their own role in keeping secrets, protecting images, and silencing pain. And she looked out at the sea of faces, leaders, family, believers, critics, and said with unshakable conviction, "This church will not survive the future if it continues to survive on silence." And the gravity of that statement lingered in the air like thunder, because it was no longer just about Russell M. Nelson but about the institution itself, about the faith that millions depended on, and about whether transparency and honesty could ever truly exist within it. And as she finally lowered her head, gripping the microphone with both hands, it became clear that Wendy Nelson had transformed what should have been a quiet funeral into a moment of reckoning. One that history may one day call the turning point, when the private truths of a prophet were dragged into the light, not by critics, not by enemies, but by the woman who knew him best, loved him most, and refused to let his memory be anything less than real.
This moment will be remembered for years to come. If you were moved, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this report with your friends. More exclusive stories and emotional updates are on the way, so stay tuned.